Well,
magandang gabi po mga katipon sa Pilipinas. Ito po ang ating katipunan, muling sumasa inyo mga tagapakinig upang magbigay ng mahalagang impormasyon, magbigay liwanag, at higit sa lahat, makinig sa inyong mga daing at kuro-kuro hinggil sa mga problemang patuloy na nagpapahirap sa ating kalagayan at kabuhayan. Sa susunod na oras, sisikapin po namin ipaliwanag ang iba-ibang bahagi ng ating ekonomiya at ang mga mabibigat pang local and international issues na may malaking epekto sa ating buhay at kinabukasan. Ngayon pong gabi, magkakaroon po tayo ng isang panauhin na will be calling us from Germany at precisely to give us an overview tungkol dito sa mga nangyari hindi lang sa Germany, kundi sa buong mundo. Ito po ang inyong katipon na si Butch Valdez. Kasamang iba pa nating mga katipon dito. Ngayon, ang kasama ko dito ay walang iba kundi yung aking panganay, si Itos Valdez ng Save the Nation Movement at ng Philippine LaRouche Society. Kami dito ay nag-aanyaya sa inyo na makibahagi sa ating talakayan sa pagsusuri ng mga kasalukuyang problema at paghahanap ng kaukulang solusyon. Go pa. Music. Schlanger, makikita niyo po siya sa Facebook at meron siyang maraming posts at maraming presentations na linalabas niya hinggil dito sa mga nangyari hindi lang sa tungkol sa coronavirus but yung kabuuan ng mga hinaharap ng ating ng sangkatauhan ngayon, no? At hindi po taliwas dito sa madalas ng pinipresenta sa atin ng LaRouche Organization na ito po ay may proseso na nagpapahina sa mga kanya-kanyang mga bansa, yung sovereignty, trying to bring down the sovereignty of different countries and weakening the social fiber, the moral fiber of all of these countries. And ito pong papakita niya sa inyo na itong mga nakaraang dekada, hindi naman masyadong ito lang 30 or 40 years na many of these countries have been slated for destruction. No? Kasama na po ang ating bansang Pilipinas diyan at marami pang mga ibang bansa na pinahina ang ating kakayanan manindigan sa ating sarili. Dinaan nila tayo sa ibang prosesong tinatawag nating foreign debt, no? At tinawakan nila tayo pa ng 5-6 para tayong ginagawang 5-6 na papautangin nila tayo pero sisigurado nila na hindi mo kakayaran na bayaran, no? So permanente kang nakautang sa kanila at ikaw naman para kang naguhukay ang bottomless pit, no? Hindi ka na makakaahon dito. Ganyan po ang kanilang pinaplano sa atin. Kanya pag nagkaroon po ng ganitong klaseng sakuna tungkol dito sa pandemic na ito, ang pinupuntirya po nila ay ang mga bansang walang kakayanan na ipagtanggol ang kanilang mga mamayan dito sa ganitong klaseng kasakitan, itong problema sa coronavirus at iba pang mga epidemya. Now, when this happens, obviously there is a hit on the population and the capacity of that country to be able to sustain the present level of economic capabilities that this country has. Sigurado po sa itong dadaanan natin na ito, lahat po ng bansa ngayon, kasama na po dyan ng Estados Unidos at ang tayo man, ang pagkatapos po ng coronavirus na ito, hindi natin ma-atim o makukuha ang normalcy, yung sinatawag nating normalcy. Kasi mag-iiba na po ang ating magiging problema at lalalim po ang ating magiging problema sa ekonomiya at mas mahihirapan po tayong umahon dahil hindi po tayo nakahanda wala tayong infrastructure na kinakailangan natin para harapin itong ganitong klaseng sakuna. We do not have enough capability for energy, for example, no capability for water kasi na-privatize na po natin yan, binigay na po natin sa pribado sektor at hanggang ngayon na pinagkikitaan po tayo ng ganito. Ngayon, isa kang bansa na wala kang capacity to be able to protect your population means a very, very difficult situation. And that's why some countries surrender their sovereignty or they just disintegrate as a country. They become subdivided into little regions that are run by warlords. No? Ganito po ang nangyayari. Dumaan na po tayo dito noon. Of course, many years ago, during the Dark Ages, no? Where whole countries were started to disintegrate and were led by warlordism. No? At ganyan po ang pwedeng mangyari sa atin dito. In the meantime, what we will do is papakita namin itong isang video na hosted by Harley Schlanger, no? Para medyo maintindihan nyo po at makikita nyo yung kanyang papunterya. Pagkatapos, i-interviewin ko po siya at pwede din kayong magpadala ng inyong mga questions para namin sa kanya, mai-relay namin sa kanya para meron tayong interaction. No? So in a few minutes, if our technical group is ready, we'll show the video of Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche International Movement.
Good morning, this is Harley Schlanger from LaRouche PAC with your morning update for April 10th, 2020. I want to start by calling your attention to a new statement which is just released on LaRouche PAC titled LaRouche's Apollo Mission to Defeat a Global Pandemic, Build a World Health System Now. This will be the centerpiece of a discussion tomorrow afternoon, that is Saturday afternoon, April 11th, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, which will be available on LaRouche PAC. Helga Zepp-LaRouche will be speaking, and I will be joining her along with several others. Now, the essence of this statement from LaRouche PAC is to look at the necessity to defeat the coronavirus worldwide. It begins with a review of the rate of growth of coronavirus, which has been quite explosive in Western Europe and the United States and continues to be a threat here. But we write, the gravest of all, we could be witnessing an explosion of infections and death in the so-called less developed sector, especially in Africa, whose underdevelopment is the Achilles heel of the entire human species. This requires an immediate, coordinated global action of the sort that Mrs. LaRouche has called for, based on an emergency summit including the 4 great nations, the US, Russia, China, and India, to create a new paradigm, a new economic system to replace the bankrupt system which has been in place now for 50 years and is responsible for much of the suffering that exists today on the planet. Now, this statement says there are 2 questions which must be addressed. One, what caused the crisis? And that is, we have to review the effects of the neoliberal, neo-colonial system, which tore down the advanced sector's healthcare and public health systems and prevented one from actually being developed in the poorer countries. So that's the first question. And the second question is, what is the full set of measures that should be adopted to address this in the United States and worldwide? There's a warning from Dr. John Nkongasong, the head of the African Centers for Disease Control, who said that the coronavirus is an existential threat for the African continent. And he said you cannot eliminate coronavirus if it still lingers in any part of the world. And just one example that we use as the problem in Africa is the Central African Republic. 5 million people live there, and there are 3 ventilators in the whole country. Now, I'll be talking tomorrow about the approach of John F. Kennedy, which was an anti-colonial approach. At the same time, Kennedy was fighting against the private bankers at the Federal Reserve who were preventing credit from going into the physical economy in the United States. And in June 1963, Kennedy issued an executive order to release Treasury notes to replace Federal Reserve notes because the Federal Reserve was not making credit available. At the same time, Kennedy was committed to making economic development the centerpiece of global policy. He had an absolute opposition to colonialism. And he said that the 1960s, and this is after he was elected president, can be and must be the crucial decade for development, including Africa. So it was his fight against the private bankers which set the basis for what could have been overcoming the colonial legacy, especially the European colonial powers' legacy in Africa, which still exists today, and by the way, was reinforced by Barack Obama, who lectured Kenyan young people or South African young people, saying, don't expect an American-style standard of living because if you get one, the planet will boil over. That's the legacy of colonialism in the former African-American president, Barack Obama. Now, while we're talking about Africa and the rest of the world, we have to take a good hard look at what's happening in the West. And we must not make the mistake of declaring prematurely victory over the virus. There were reports yesterday from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx saying that it does appear as though the estimates of deaths in the United States can be lowered still from this fraudulent Imperial College of London figure of 2.2 million. They're now saying maybe 60,000. But we can't declare victory too soon because we haven't had a victory. There were still almost 1,000 deaths in New York State yesterday. Now take the example of China, where the Chinese have said zero growth in new cases does not mean zero risk. And they're being very vigilant to keep an eye out for a second or even a third wave of the spread of the disease. Now, yesterday, President Trump made very clear that we have to remain vigilant, remain with the social distancing policy, and he praised Americans for making difficult decisions for the sake of others. I think with this weekend being Easter weekend, that's a good way to think about it, that we act for the benefit of others, that's what our lives must be. And if we're lucky enough to not have coronavirus in our family and to have the resources to make it, we have to make sure everyone has that. In Africa, social distancing and hand washing are a problem. Hand washing because there's an absence of clean water for whole sections of the continent. Now, as we talk about achieving a victory on the healthcare front, and again, let me remind you, we're far from being at that point yet. But as we talk about that, the ultimate victory depends on breaking the power of the global casino economy. And this has been, if you look at the world today, why we're in such a terrible shape for addressing something like a viral disease, it's that we've had the wrong policy in place because of those who control the global financial system. It's been in the hands of private bankers operating through central banks. It's not even governments that control policy. The central banks have been controlling the policy of governments, and that must stop. Now, we see that in the problem in the United States today, where you still have an intent of the president to act to provide relief to those people who have lost jobs. And by the way, another 6.6 million jobs were lost last week, meaning over 16 million in the last 3 weeks. And there's steps being taken to make the Federal Reserve more open to what they're calling Main Street lending. There's a new plan for $2.3 trillion to be made available for businesses with up to 10,000 employees. Now, 10,000 employees, that's not a mom and pop shop. So a lot of this money is going to go to larger corporations, not the biggest corporations, but larger corporations. But $900 billion will be made available for small businesses. So far, the money is not getting dispersed adequately or quickly enough to the small businesses, but they're working on that. But the problem is that the bulk of the money being pumped into the economy by the Federal Reserve is still going through quantitative easing and the so-called liquidity measures to secure financial markets, which means to the speculative economy. Now, one of the things that happened in the last couple of days is that we're seeing more corporate debt downgraded to junk. Now, this is not because of the coronavirus. This is because corporations have been borrowing and borrowing and borrowing to stay in business, and in many cases, borrowing money to buy their own stock. There's $200 billion of corporate debt that's been marked down to junk level in the last 3 months. And the Federal Reserve is now buying junk bonds. This is something that's unprecedented. So they're buying the junk bonds. Who owns the junk bonds? Well, these are people who are speculators. And so if we're going to win this fight, we have to cut off the federal funds to the speculators now. Not in 6 months or 2 years or 10 years. We need a shift at present to turn the credit system into a Hamiltonian national credit system. Now, I mentioned John Kennedy before. Kennedy's view is that you must have collaboration of sovereign nation states to address these crises. This is the view that Lyndon LaRouche has always put forward. And this is what Donald Trump said in his September 2019 address to the United Nations, that relations in the world should be between sovereign nation states, each acting for the benefit of their own country, but in coordination with others. The whole purpose of Russiagate was to prevent Trump from doing that, from working together with Russia, with China, and other countries. Now we have an opportunity to put that behind us. We can use this crisis to address the problem of who's been making policy in the United States. And you see that in terms of the recent vote in the Congress, where only one congressman stood up against the vast amounts of liquidity going from the Federal Reserve to the speculative economy. One congressman, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, who was condemned by everyone, whereas in 2008, at least 230 congressmen voted against the bailout bill, the initial one. So I'm encouraging you to join us tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. At the LaRouchePAC.com website for an online town hall meeting addressed by Helga Zepp LaRouche and myself and others. This will give you an opportunity to get a better sense of what we're fighting for, and also a chance to register for our April 25th and 26th two-day conference on how to introduce the new paradigm to replace the bankrupt system which has been in place for the last 5 decades. So thank you for joining me today. Share this video as widely as possible and organize your friends to join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you and goodbye. To replace the bankrupt system, which has been in place for the last 5 decades. So thank you for joining me today. Share this video.
Okay, balik na po tayo dito sa ating katipunan. Ito po yung katipunan si Butch Valdez. At kakatapos lang nyo po mapanood. Ito pong brief presentation ni Mr. Harley Schlanger, no? Who right now I believe is now connected to us, not yet. And we're still trying to link up with him. No? But he's waiting for us, even if it's on this holiday. It's, alam niyo po, Easter. Easter is a big celebration date all over the world, including naman the Filipinas. No? Pero doon din sa America, Easter is a major holiday. No? But we've been able to ask Harley. Okay, is Harley on the air now? Harley?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, good evening, Harley.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, and maybe as good as you are.
Well, we'll see.
Okay, Harley. We just, we aside from giving them a briefing, a bit about the LaRouche organization, I also took it upon ourselves to be able to present your presentation in Facebook, I believe, no? And that so they had a few minutes of understanding what you're talking about. So, but let me ask the questions and let's see if our audience. So, by the way, our audience is they're coming from all over the world, not just the Philippines. We have a lot of Filipinos. We have a lot of Filipinos coming from Japan, Hong Kong, and the Middle East and Europe. When we have quite a few also calling us from the United States.
I hope we have some from Los Angeles, because there's a large Filipino community in Los Angeles.
We probably have, Harley. Okay, Harley, there's so many topics that I'd like to approach this with, but let's approach it from the basis of your talk that we just presented. You had called, Helga and you and the rest of the organization in LaRouche has called for a global coordinated approach in as far as health, developing an effective healthcare system. How is this done in real terms, Harley?
Well, there are two aspects to it. The first one is we need an immediate, urgent, emergency buildup of healthcare capabilities for the present crisis. As people know, we don't know exactly how large this will be, how extensive it is, but we're seeing now that it's starting to spread to the southern hemisphere, where there's much less preparation in terms of healthcare in depth, largely because of the policies of the international banks and the International Monetary Fund, which has not allowed the nations of Africa, a number of the South Asian nations, the South American nations, they haven't been able to invest in even minimal health care. So we need to make sure that even as we're continuing the fight in Europe and the United States and China and elsewhere, that as we start to turn this around, we have to make in-depth capabilities available for countries that don't have them. Just as an example, the Central African Republic is a country with 5 million people. They have 3 ventilators in the whole country. So there are immediate things that have to be done to provide some protection. But then we get to the real issue, because if we can turn back the plague, the effect of the coronavirus, we can't go back to the same economic policy, because that economic policy, as you know, Lyndon LaRouche warned 40 years ago, if you cut budgets, if you have austerity, then you're going to have new diseases. Because the population, because of low nutrition, because of lack of health care, lack of overall economic well-being, becomes more susceptible. And we're not only facing a coronavirus pandemic, but a financial crash in the Western world. So we have to change the economic policies as well. So the two go hand in hand. And Butch, I'll tell you, I wrote an article about 3 months ago when the coronavirus was first on the radar. And I said, don't blame the coronavirus for the financial crash. This has been coming since 2008, the next phase of the financial crash.
That's right, yeah. Well, definitely, that's what we've been saying. Then the financial system being in process of collapse has been going on. But somehow a major hit when the coronavirus actually came. Wall Street hit something like 2,000 points dive within a matter of days, and this was not just a wake-upper, but this was looked at as something like doomsday for world economy. What is you said that we have to have a good healthcare system that is connected with the rest of the world, which means a global healthcare system, wherein every country somehow cooperates and coordinates with each other so that we can fight things like plagues and pandemics. Now, this cannot be done, however, with the present financial policies of and economic policies of the rest of the world. There has to be a major change. What would that major change entail, Harley?
Well, you're absolutely right about that, and that's why, for us, the two issues are the same. You have to get back to a fully productive global economy where you don't have a small number of wealthy countries living off the cheap labor and the debt collection of the poorer countries. So we need to have what Mrs. LaRouche calls a new paradigm, or what Lyndon LaRouche used to call a new Bretton Woods.
Yeah.
Now, this
excuse me, Harley, I just wanted to butt in, if you allow me. This
Sure.
thing that we need to change is the idea of globalization. Remember, is this what we need to change? The idea of globalization, wherein jobs are sent over to the developing countries because they're cheaper, and there's lots of jobs in the developed countries. But just because they're cheaper does not make those developing countries any richer. Is this what we should get out of, this globalization concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are two aspects to globalization. One is we should encourage real fair trade for the whole world, because there are things that are produced in some countries that are better than others, and there are countries that need goods that are produced in the advanced sector. But what was done under the name of globalization and under the World Trade Organization was to ship out, or outsource as it's called, manufacturing from the United States and from Western Europe into poorer countries where the work conditions didn't have the same regulations, where wages were low, where raw materials were cheap. And so it provided cheap goods for the advanced sector.
Yeah.
But as you point out, the wages were relatively low where they moved. For example, in auto parts, the production of parts for automobiles in Detroit or in Cleveland, you had people working for $40 or $50 an hour. When you ship it to Vietnam or to Guatemala, they may be working for $3 a day.
Right.
So this was the kind of, it's not just unfair and unjust, it's economically stupid. Because what happened in the United States, for example, is we lost 6 million manufacturing jobs between 2001 and 2018. 6 million that paid relatively high wages. Where did those people go? A small number of them got hired by tech firms where they could make some money. But the vast majority of them had to take 2 or 3 jobs to be able to continue to pay their rent or their home mortgage or their health care or take care of their family. And so we had a net reduction of living standards in the United States as the living standards were not significantly improved in the countries where the industries went. So that form of globalization doesn't work, and it was exposed also with the coronavirus, because we found out, and this is something I didn't know, and maybe your listeners don't know this, but we don't produce pharmaceutical drugs in the United States anymore. 90% of the drugs that are used in hospitals and by doctors in the United States are produced in other countries. And much of that is from China. Now, what happens when you have something like the coronavirus hit China, so the factories close? Well, where are we going to get the pharmaceuticals we need in the United States? So this is where we get to the concept that Lyndon LaRouche had of national sovereignty. Each nation has to develop certain full set machine tool capabilities, capabilities in sections of the service sector like pharmaceuticals and others.
Yes.
And that's when you talk about a global healthcare system. No country should be dependent on one other country for necessary items like the kinds of emergency masks that are needed, or the gloves, or the protective gowns, or the ventilators. Every country needs to develop its own capability to produce that. So that's where countries like the United States and China, which have been gearing up the production of these things, also Germany now, should be producing extra and make them available, and I would say virtually free of charge. You know, the Chinese are shipping equipment all over the world right now, including to the United States. So you have a funny thing, Butch, I'm sure you've seen this, where you have people like Pompeo, the Secretary of State, accusing China of being anti-American and preparing to go to war with us. And then Trump is praising China for sending plane loads of equipment to New York City, where there's a shortage of equipment. So that's why every nation needs to have certain minimal industrial capabilities, public health care expenditures, and you're absolutely right, you can't do that with the International Monetary Fund system or the World Trade Organization, so-called free trade agreements. Those have to be scrapped.
Okay, now I think it's pretty clear to our listeners that this present system, the way we see it and the way we've been working with for the past how many decades now, has to be scrapped. Now, how is that done, Harley? Let's say we're moving. I don't think this kind of thinking should start after this pandemic thing. I think this kind of thinking should start now. And even the build-up, the build-up and preparation for it must already start now, because this might not be our first and last pandemic. What are the first steps towards creating the conditions to make this paradigm shift?
Well, one of the things you see is the shock effect of the pandemic in countries like Italy, Spain, Germany. I live in Germany now, where no one thought this could happen in advanced industrial economies. So they weren't prepared for it. Now, what Mrs. LaRouche called for is an emergency summit of the great powers, what Lyndon LaRouche identified as the four sovereign powers: the United States, Russia, China, and India. Because those four countries have the capability to function independent of the global financial system, which is largely run out of Wall Street, Brussels, and the City of London. Now, that means you need to have Putin, Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi, and Donald Trump sit down together and discuss, first of all, what needs to be done to handle the emergency. And in particular, we have to address the crisis in Africa, because it would be completely immoral to come up with a solution for the advanced sector countries and then turn our backs on our brothers and sisters in Africa who are going to be suffering because of the economic policies imposed on them. So the first task of an emergency summit is emergency aid. But then what you need to do is immediately make a decision that we're no longer going to protect speculators. Because the main thing about the present system is it's a system for speculators, typified by immoral bastards like George Soros, who think nothing of destroying the currency of a country to make a profit.
Yeah.
Soros seems to think that he's acting on behalf of God, and of course we would say he's acting on behalf of the devil. Because what he does is he finds countries that are weak and purchases their currency and then dumps it to force them to pay the dollars that they have so he can make a profit. Now, the speculation has grown immeasurably since the 1971 change away from Bretton Woods. So the emergency summit has to establish that we're not going to have the floating exchange system anymore. And the way to start that would be between those four powers, make multilateral agreements on pegging their currencies and the dollar at a certain level, and then bringing in other countries to have their currencies adjusted so that we are not exploiting nations, but we give everyone the basis of a fair trade on their currencies. Now, since some countries are poor, they're going to need aid. And this should be two types. One would be debt moratoria or debt write-off. This is something that must happen, and it's now being discussed fairly widely. So you have an emergency summit that establishes new exchange rates, that gets rid of a certain portion of the debt, and then extends new...
Yeah. Yeah, well, we lost...
take place.
You still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good. Yeah, I lost you for a few seconds there. And you were talking about the debt and how it should be canceled off, or how is it?
Well, UNCTAD made a proposal that $1 trillion of debt from African countries should be canceled. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look around the world, the trillion is a fairly small amount of debt to be canceled. But if you started with that, it would mean that many nations would not have to hold back revenue from healthcare and emergencies to pay debt first. Under the International Monetary Fund system, which is an immoral system, debt must be paid first. That has to stop.
Let me intervene, Harley. I just want our listeners to understand that what you're saying exactly now is exactly the situation here in the Philippines. We have a provision in law where in all of these legislators, how dumb as they can be, made the debt service payment, foreign debt service payment, as a how do you say it? Automatic and having priority over all other expenses. And the debt that we're talking about is not just the foreign debt. You see, what they have done before was that our foreign debt was so heavy, they've managed to be able to create domestic debt by issuing bonds, the central bank issuing local bonds, in order to take off this foreign debt burden away from the creditors and leave it again to government. So we have a whole, maybe about 7 trillion maybe of debt now, and being paid in this way, that the big percentage of all of it must have priority and automatic before we even consider any expenses for ourselves, for our country, for our food, for all of our needs. That's I just wanted to add that to what you're saying now, Harley.
Yeah, that's called. Then what was done is that the International Monetary Fund, once you shift the debt in such a way that it is the first priority of the budget, the International Monetary Fund is essentially controlling the fiscal policy of governments, taking away sovereignty. So you may have an election and vote for people who say, we're going to build highways, we're going to build power plants, we're going to build dams and flood control. But the International Monetary Fund comes in and says, no, you're not, because your first priority is to pay the debt. Yeah. So under the conditionalities, the sovereignty of nations, including the Philippines, and including the United States, you no longer have sovereignty. You have banks dictating policy. And this came up in a very big way last August at the Federal Reserve meeting, the annual meeting they have in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where a group of bankers proposed that not just the monetary policy be controlled by central banks, and central banks are run by private banks, but the government policy, spending, fiscal policy should be controlled by the banks. Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about is absolutely the case. You take away from governments the ability, even if the government has a surplus, that money has to go first to the debtors. And we saw this with Argentina in a very nasty way when Macri was the president in Argentina. You had vulture funds buy the debt from the banks and go to court and get courts in the United States to rule that those funds had the right to seize Argentine assets, including the Argentine embassy in Washington, D.C. So this is how crazy this becomes.
Yes.
Now, that has to stop. Now, but the next phase, and this is very important, is that we have to re-regulate banks. Every nation has to adopt banking regulation reforms which put in the hands of elected governments and their treasuries the currency, credit, and debt policy of the country, so that you don't have private banks determining how much credit is available and who it goes to. And I'll give you an example of the problem. The bailout bill that just passed the U.S. Congress included $2.2 trillion, most of which is going toward small businesses, toward hospitals, to cities and state governments, and a certain amount of one-time payment to virtually every family in the United States of $1,200. Now, that's all well and good, but it included within it almost $500 billion of money for the Federal Reserve to use to buy worthless assets off the books of banks. In addition to that, the Federal Reserve is going to create $4 trillion that will be allocated to speculators to keep the value of the debt on their books at their book value. In other words, people who have been buying and selling junk bonds, which should go into bankruptcy. Instead, they're going to get money from the Federal Reserve to keep the game going. And this includes mortgages. We're going to see a wave of foreclosures again, just like 2008, unless there's legislation to stop it. So we're dealing with a runaway situation where the speculators have bankrupted the world economy, and they're going to force governments to bail them out while the governments have no money to help people facing the coronavirus or unemployment, poverty, and things of that sort.
Well, as you speak, we're actually, I am sure our listeners are able to immediately identify with what's going on and why our country is now unable to generate the funds in order to address starvation. There is actual starvation going on now, and there is some beginnings of street violence where people are trying to stop cars and out of anger. I don't know if they know. I don't think it's for food, but out of anger. And this is the situation we're facing right now. As you were speaking,
but let me just say, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have almost 1/3 of the population facing severe food insecurity, which means hunger. Maybe not even having one meal a day. And 55% face
one meal a day for 55% of the population.
That because of the structural reforms and the trade policies that are imposed on them, Africans produce food that gets shipped to Europe, so that the food that their people need gets shipped to Europe, and then they have to buy 40% of the food they consume on international markets. So they're losing twice. They're producing food that they can't consume, and they're having to use the revenue they get from that food to buy food to replace it. So the food question is the other thing that must be taken up as part of the emergency measures. Because how do you fight a disease in the population that's malnourished?
That's right.
How do you fight a disease where you tell people one of the solutions is wash your hands when they don't have clean water?
Yep. Let's go back to the previous solutions that you brought up, Harley. The first one, if I may summarize, was the basically to stop this whole system of speculation, which means governments will have to the four governments will have to get together and decide how they're going to stop investments and resources of a government and private sector from going into speculation. The second one is to re-regulate banks. If I understood it correctly, you wanted the banks to do what they're supposed to be doing, not necessarily to feed into the speculative investments, but more to be able to become vehicles for credit for new businesses. Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. And what that means is that the idea of the universal bank model, which means that a commercial bank can also engage in investment and trading, in other words, speculation. What happened that led to 2008, the crash of 2008, was the repeal of the banking separation bill in the United States, the Glass-Steagall bill, and something similar throughout Europe in the 1995 to 2002 period, so that commercial banks could now use their depositors' deposits as leverage for speculation. Now, this became, after 2008, the new law, that money is no longer your money, it's now the bank's money. And they could take in what's called a bail-in. They can take, if you have a deposit, a savings deposit with, say, $5,000 in it, the bank can take the whole thing if they need it. This was allowed under European Union law and the so-called Dodd-Frank law. So that's got to be repealed.
You mean to say there is precisely a provision that allows these banks to just confiscate your deposits in their bank?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
boy.
justified under Dodd-Frank. And what it means to re-regulate means that, and the reason they do that is because they know that if they go bankrupt, if they bet on bad investments and lose the money, they'll get bailed out. The banks will get bailed out,
Yeah.
but the customers might not. And that's what happened in 2008, where the banks got somewhere close to $23 trillion total. But 7 million families in the United States lost their homes. They didn't get bailed out. They didn't get protected, including from swindles that were carried out by the banks with the mortgages that were too expensive and the adjustable interest rates and so on. So we've got to make banks, as you say, go back to their old business.
Yes, old business which is nawala. Yeah.
Products that go into the real physical economy, such as infrastructure, such as manufacturing.
Yeah, we lost you in a few seconds again. At least I think you were about to say that the bank should go back to its old business of being able to distribute credit for different enterprises instead of going into speculation. Now,
Exactly.
Now, that is those are those three main steps already. Is there a fourth step?
Well, the third step, just to finish it.
Yes.
The second step is the first step is bank re-regulation. The second step is national banking, where you have governments decide fiscal policies as opposed to speculators. And they do that through a national bank or the national treasury. The third step is infrastructure, because infrastructure includes the things that are necessary to cheapen the cost of production. If you don't have adequate transportation, if you don't have heating capabilities, if you don't have electricity, then an economy functions on a much lower basis. And we've been cheating infrastructure spending in every country because they say, well, it doesn't make money. That's nonsense. It doesn't make money directly, but it makes everything that's done with the economy cheaper, more productive.
Yeah.
So we need new platforms of infrastructure is the third point. And then the fourth point is that every nation needs to have certain science driver projects, whether it's development of nuclear fusion power, a space program, optical biophysics for dealing with viruses and things of that sort, where you're taking a certain amount of money and putting it into research and development in the frontiers of science, and you're also training a cadre of young people to become scientists, engineers, and inventors. So that's what we call LaRouche's 4 laws: the banking regulation, the credit policy, infrastructure investment, and emphasis on advanced sectors of scientific research and development. And that could be done under a new financial system for every nation on the planet.
Right. I want to go back on this new regulation, re-regulate the banking sector. You mentioned, and I think this has to be understood by our listeners, the setting up of a national bank. Okay. Right now, there is no such thing as a national bank. We have a central banking system. The central banking system in most parts of the world, if not all, are independent of the national, independent of national government, the way it looks, the way they function. Now, when you say we have to have a national banking system, what do we mean?
Well, what you just described is exactly true, that you have private bankers who are authorized by the central bank to handle the credit functions of the government. So they sell bonds, and they make money on that. Now, bonds are supposed to be creating credit for production. So why do you set up separate bond markets for speculators? That's what the central bank system is right now, and it means that private bankers then can dictate to the government where the money can be spent. Now, the model of a national bank is the system of Alexander Hamilton. And what Hamilton understood was that you need credit. The credit is not bad. The question is, where does the credit go and who benefits from the credit? He had this maxim, never take on a debt without the means to extinguish it, without the means to pay it off.
Right.
Now, the other model in the world at the time was the Dutch Central Bank and the Bank of England, which were private banks. Mm-hmm. And Hamilton opposed that and said that under the U.S. Constitution, it's the Treasury that issues credit based on the Congress. So in other words, you're electing representatives to decide where the money should be directed.
And how much money should be circulated, right?
Yes. Now, this was something that the advocates of British banking opposed, because they said that's not a free market. That if the government decides that it's going to issue credit at 2% to go into road building, and there'll be no credit available for speculators, then how do banks make profits? Well, the point of banking is it should be a public trust. That doesn't mean that the bankers are going to be poor. It just means they're not going to be parasites. And Hamilton's system does put a limit, to some extent, on the amount of wealth that private individuals can make. But it doesn't make them poor. It doesn't take away their freedom for investment. It puts the general welfare or the common good first. Now, the last 40 to 50 years, the central bank system has become the funder of the doctrine of neoliberalism, which basically says, no, profit is how an economy works. Money is what's most important. So if you have a choice of buying a risky junk bond, which might give you a 20% return, or putting it into a municipal utility district to produce clean water, which might give you a 3% return, the speculators say they should be free to get money from the government to take the risk at the 20%, knowing that if they fail, they'll get bailed out. That's the present system. That is a complete fraud. It's an immoral fraud invented by the Adam Smith and the Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian calculus. And that's why you have such extreme gaps between the ultra wealthy and the vast majority of the population. Because if the government is there through central banks giving money to speculators, like this $4 trillion I mentioned, the bailout, they're going to go buy the stocks that have collapsed cheaply. And when the stocks go up, they're going to make fortunes based on having been given credit by the government.
Right.
When you and your family may be cut off by the bank, so you can't pay your mortgage, you can't pay credit cards, you can't buy food, you can't buy health care.
Yeah.
That's the immorality of the system.
That level of immorality, Harley, is present here in the Philippines right now. This is precisely and exactly what we are fighting against now. And how the oligarchy had taken over all of our public utilities. And over and above that, they also control the commercial banking system. Over and above that, they also control the media as they do in other countries. But they've set it up in such a way that they dictate, and basically they dictate as to who will live and who will die. And they've covered themselves up, precisely as you were saying about some provision by the IMF that these people cannot lose, and that if they lose money, government owes them. And this is where the immorality of it all is present. They are not allowed to lose, and they are, by law, must collect from government whatever they had lost. They don't even bother.
In the U.S., this was called the too big to fail system. That when a bank is so large that the system depends on it, then it gets a bailout. That was what became essentially the policy that governed the 2008 bailout after the crash. Instead,
yes, we lost you again.
They're investigated to find out if what they did was criminal.
Uh-huh.
Am I still on?
Yeah, you're on.
There were no criminal indictments after 2008. There should have been.
Yes.
Now, one country that has a different system is China, because China has state banks. Now China also has billionaires, so the state banking system doesn't prevent people from making money, but it creates a system where people make money by doing what's good for the country. And one of the difficulties that Trump has had in negotiating with China on a trade deal is some of Trump's Treasury people want China to adopt the American banking method. And the Chinese correctly refuse to do that because they see banking as something that's necessary to lift people out of poverty, to continue to develop the nation, to collaborate in developing other nations through the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is something that the anti-China crowd in the United States is trying to stop because they see that as a threat to the continuation of the existing corrupt financial system.
Okay. Harley, I have somebody sent in a question. It comes from Ver, who's also one of our staff here in the Philippine LaRouche Society. He says, you mentioned something on JFK, sort of him issuing an executive order replacing the Federal Reserve notes because it's not doing what JFK intends to do. Can it be done now in the US? Can it be replicated in other countries?
Absolutely. I mean, what Kennedy did was in June 1963, he had been involved in a long-term fight with the Federal Reserve to get them to lower interest rates so the steel industry could modernize. There was a fight going on between labor and the steel industry, and the steel industry was saying they can't pay higher wages because they're stuck with bad debts from their old equipment and they can't modernize. So Kennedy did two things. He had an investment tax credit plan where he let them, if companies invested in new plant and equipment, new jobs, new products, they got a tax credit. And then they could borrow money to make sure they could carry out the modernization. Yeah. The Federal Reserve didn't support that, so Kennedy issued an order to produce treasury notes, which is exactly what Lincoln did with the greenback policy to fight the Civil War. Now, I think many of us at the historians, myself included, at the LaRouche organization, think this is why Kennedy was killed. It wasn't just that he was opposing the Vietnam War. but that he was trying to move the country out from the control of the private bankers, who are the same people who wanted wars. Now, there's a question, is absolutely the right question. The president can issue Treasury credit. In fact, that's what Trump is starting to do by having the Treasury intervene in the Federal Reserve policy. The problem is that at present, they're only doing it for bailouts of the banks and the shadow banking system. What Trump should do is then say, okay, well, look, we can produce money out of thin air, so why don't we produce credit for production and issue bonds that would go into infrastructure? And he tweeted the other day that he would be willing to do a $2 trillion infrastructure bill for the United States for what he called phase 4 of the relief package. So he could do what Kennedy did, $2 trillion in Treasury notes as a bond offering that would then go directly into major advances in American infrastructure. And that could be done by any country. Now, the problem is, if you're a country like the Philippines and you try and do it, the international banks will probably say, if you try to do that, we're going to foreclose on you. We're going to demand immediate payment on your outstanding debts. And you will be cut off completely, not just from credit, but from any kind of convertibility to convert your currency to dollars or anything else, the so-called SWIFT system. So you will be punished if a poor country tries to do that. But that's why it's important to have an agreement with the most powerful countries that say every country in the world can adopt.
Right. Yes. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So we lost you at that. So that every country can adopt this new system. Right. Is that the same as the Glass-Steagall Act, or is it Bretton Woods Agreement?
Well, it's part of it. You need the Glass-Steagall Act so that the banks don't take advantage of it. But that would be part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The part of the new Bretton Woods Agreement would be that the credit generation of nations would be protected by the big countries, so that your dollars would not become immediately seized, or your property seized to collect the old debt. So I think that's why we need to have a new Bretton Woods that would be protected by the major countries.
Yeah. Yeah, Harley, you still there? Yeah. No, I was just gonna ask.
Yeah, I'm here.
It's not really off this topic, but are you when countries like now you're saying that countries are now having difficulty with their foreign debt situation, and is it right now something that should be considered to declare a unilateral debt moratorium policy?
Well, that may be what countries have to do. I don't know if you remember this, but in 1982, Lyndon LaRouche said that the Latin American countries, which were being penalized terribly by the IMF over their debts, LaRouche said they should join together and declare a joint debt moratorium. He called it the debt bomb. And this became a major issue at the time. Now, the problem with that is that if there are two, well, either you can have an orderly debt reorganization, or it can be disorderly. And if it's disorderly, like one country just says we're not going to pay, that could trigger a global financial collapse. But an orderly debt reorganization would require what we're talking about, an emergency agreement by the major powers to protect countries from their debt and to allow them, if necessary, to have a debt freeze or a debt forgiveness. So that's the importance of the emergency summit. And I think this is really an important point, because if you're going to do anything right now, whether it's a global health system, whether it's going to be to end the injustice of the International Monetary Fund and its conditionalities, the debt collection and so on, all of this requires agreement by major powers. And the Chinese are strong enough that they can play a role in this. The Russians are...
We'll hold you on that thought. We'll take a 1-minute break for the station.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. Dito po tayo sa Ating Katipunan. Ako po si Butch Valdez. Ang ating pong special guest this evening is our friend from the LaRouche organization, Mr. Harley Schlanger. Harley, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, I was too excited to start off the program earlier. I forgot to greet you Happy Easter and your family.
Same to you.
Okay. Yeah, before we broke off, we were talking about Xi Jinping and Putin and on the four-power thing. I was just wondering whether, what is holding this up? What is holding the four-power agreement, the move towards that direction?
Well, I would say two things. One is the coronavirus, because as you know, President Trump is very much hands-on right now, treating this as being a wartime president. And so for him to devote the time that would be needed to prepare for the summit and get to a summit would be somewhat difficult. Also, you know, until recently, the Chinese had the same situation. And, you know, with the case of India, we're not sure what's happening there with coronavirus. So that's one factor. The other factor is that there is discussion going on. Trump has had 3 talks with Putin in the last week. He had a very productive talk with Xi Jinping a week ago Friday, and they're continuing the discussions. I don't know for sure about Modi, but Trump is also talking with Abe in Japan. He's talking with Macron. So there is a lot of discussion of the great powers, and there's a general agreement. The closest to the four-power agreement was an agreement to have the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council meet sometime in the near future. The problem in the United States is that there are people that don't want to do that. You have the neoconservatives, the Democratic Party anti-Trump crowd is working together with people like Senator Rubio of Florida, Mitch McConnell, the people who don't want to change from the neoliberal system because they get so much campaign money from the bankers.
Right.
So there's a real problem politically that of disagreement. Now, if the American people knew these issues that we were discussing, If the media didn't black it out, and if they hadn't smeared LaRouche for so many years, these would be issues that people would be familiar with. And I'm sure, and I know this from the work I do, that when people hear what we're saying, they say, well, that makes sense, why don't we do it?
Right.
And then you point out, this is why we had Russiagate. They didn't want Trump to talk to Putin. They don't want Trump to talk with Xi Jinping. These anti-China nutcases in the United States are running around saying that China somehow is responsible for the coronavirus deaths in the United States. So we have to overcome this Cold War geopolitical thinking that dominates in the United States and in Western Europe. And there's just another example on that. Why are we continuing to have sanctions against countries that are facing tragic consequences from the coronavirus, like Iran, like Venezuela? This is a war crime to put sanctions on a country that prevents.
Yes. We're losing, there are some...
continuing effects. Am I back now?
Yeah, we lose you only for a few seconds. You just keep on talking,
okay.
We'll catch up.
The continuous effect of geopolitical doctrine, which is a British theory that's adopted by all the neoconservative war hawks in the United States, that's one of the reasons that we haven't had this emergency summit yet. But this is something that Mrs. LaRouche brings up every single week in her German and her English language webcasts. I've been bringing it up virtually every day. I do a daily briefing, a 10-minute or 12-minute briefing every single day on, it's available on the LaRouche Pack YouTube channel that your listeners could tune into if they'd like to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the point here is, Harley, we've always been saying that this thing is urgent, and the whole thing is, many problems that are now besetting the world, aside from this pandemic, which will not be the last one, will be starting to come up in the near future. If we go along the same pace that we're doing in trying to get this thing, the whole thing might just overwhelm us, and the thing collapses from under us. Is there a trigger of some sort that can be initiated, or can Putin and Xi Jinping initiate something that does not necessarily include the United States for the meantime? And then eventually, but Trump is somehow connected with it, but not officially. But the move towards what we're saying can be affected. Is that possible?
Well, I certainly agree with you on the urgency. The longer you wait with this, the more danger there is, because you could have a mutation of the virus. You could have a collapse of the financial system because the bailouts won't work.
Yeah.
So it is urgent. But the problem is, you and I are not in a government.
Yeah.
And we're not in a position where we can say, let's sit down tomorrow and work this out. Putin and Xi Jinping are in regular discussion. And, I think the reason that it's so important to have the United States involved in it is because the world is still functioning on a dollar system. If the United States is not involved, it would be extremely difficult.
That's right.
On the other hand, if you have to wait for the political situation inside the United States to change, it may be too late. Yeah. This is an important point. Every day when I do a radio interview or talk to people in politics, I'm telling them, every day we lose is a day where potentially millions of people can die. Do you want that on your conscience? Is this the lack of morality that's going to typify the United States at this moment in history? Or will we have a Franklin Roosevelt moment or a John Kennedy moment where we suddenly realize, look, we should be taking the leadership of improving the conditions for people all over the world? And the problem is that for all the good intentions Trump may have on some of these issues, he doesn't have the same view of things that you and I do. And that's a problem. He's not what you might call a Hamiltonian humanist. He comes through the rough and tumble world of New York construction, and he does things his own way, and sometimes that's a benefit. But in terms of urgency,
he realizes it. Yes.
Trump initially said, we're going to get auto companies to be involved in producing ventilators. So he asked General Motors if they would do it, and they said yes. And a week went by and nothing happened. So then he ordered Peter Navarro to tell General Motors, start producing ventilators today, and they did. So the president does have that kind of authority. So he should and can do it, and we have to keep fighting to get people of goodwill in the United States and around the world to push to have the summit take place as quickly as possible.
Arlie, are we at this point confident that we have been able to intervene in certain areas as LaRouche organization and influence certain thinkers in the leadership, not just in the White House, but also in the armed forces of the United States of America?
Well, if you look back at President Trump's 2016 campaign, he put into the Republican Party platform support for Glass-Steagall.
Yeah.
And the last month of his campaign, he campaigned for it.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? That's something that we were the most prominent advocates of Glass-Steagall in the United States.
Right.
Similarly, on the idea of collaboration between the United States and Russia, and the United States and China, this is something that Lyndon LaRouche has been fighting for years until his death, and Mrs. LaRouche has taken up the responsibility for that. And Trump, to his credit, still says that in spite of all the idiocy from Mike Pompeo and some of the anti-China crowd, he still says Xi Jinping is my personal friend. I have great respect for him and for the people of China. At the same time, he says he's going to work with Putin. So what we have to do, since if we're not in a situation where we can sit down with Trump and advise him, but our potential to intervene in this is with the Trump supporters. You know, at least a third of the American people are very strong supporters of what Trump is trying to do. And if they're aggressive and organized to do the right thing, then they can move the so-called independents, which represent another third of the U.S. population, to support the president. So, you know, we have an election coming up in 6 months in the United States. It looks like it's going to be Trump against Biden. Biden is going to be a rerun of Hillary Clinton. So that would be a disaster. But Trump should take up the LaRouche policy. But it means we're going to have to mobilize his supporters to let him know that they would stand by him completely if he did that.
Yeah.
So that's our job, and the job of people who are friends of LaRouche.
Well, we here in the Philippines will always be working with you, Harley, as we have for the past how many years now, decades, as a matter of fact. And I've had you now for more than an hour already, Harley. And I should let you go since it's Easter time. Can you have the floor for the last minute message that you want to have for the Filipino people?
and have a little picnic here in our yard. Look, I think the most important thing, Butch, is that we've covered the leading issues, the need for the four-power agreement, the need for a new Bretton Woods, the need for LaRouche's four laws. Your listeners can study these things. They're available. I'm sure you have, you get this material out. It's available in English at LaRouchePAC.com. LaRouchePAC.com. And I think what we realize is that the world is crying for change. The present system will not survive. The question is, will we replace it with a system based on principles of natural law and physical economy, or will we go into chaos? And I think if people become more familiar with the ideas of LaRouche, they'll be able to go out and campaign for them and insist in every country. Because I talk to people from African countries, from all over Europe, from the United States, from Latin America. People are hungry for answers and solutions, but they also realize that they've been deprived a connection to LaRouche for many, many years because of the fact that he was attacked so hard by the proponents, the supporters of the British system. So what I would say is we should be optimistic. People are looking for solutions. We have solutions. We just have to be everywhere we can be to get those out to people, whether we're talking to people in government, talking to people, co-workers, people in our churches, just in our neighborhood. We just have to be aggressively giving them a sense that now is the time for good people to make a difference in the future.
That's right. Okay, well, Harry, thank you very much for joining us today, Easter time. And thank you, we thank your family also for lending you to us for the last hour. Hopefully this will not be the first and the last time that we're engaging with you. I know you've joined us some years back, maybe 2 or 3 times already before. So we can start the whole series again if you're available in the next few weeks or few months. Thank you very much, Harry.
Sure. Okay, Butch, I always enjoy talking with you, and I know some of the people from the Philippine LaRouche Society, and I'm very happy to be a collaborator with you.
Okay, thank you. Happy Easter.
Okay, same to you. Bye.
Okay, mag-break muna tayo. Okay, balik po tayo dito sa ating katipunan. Ito po ang inyong katipunan si Butch Valdez at kakatapos lang po natin makapanayam ang ating pong isang kaibigan from LaRouche International. Nandun siya sa Germany now, no? Si Harley Schlanger. No? At nabigyan niya tayo ng napakaraming puntos na sana po sana po inaintindihan natin, no? Bagamat siyempre para sa mga iba medyo first time yung naririnig yan, pero andito po tayo para mabigyan natin ng konting paliwanag, no? Ang linalabas natin po sa LaRouche Organization ay ang mga puntos na importante na kailangan maintindihan natin. Sa kanyang pinalabas po, ang sinasabi niya, kanya po nagkaritong ganitong sitwasyon ng ating mundo para bagang hindi nakahanda paglabas nitong pandemic na ito dahil yung pinairal na sistema ng ekonomiya na pinairal nung several decades ago, humina ang kakayanan ng mga bansa na maprotektahan ang kanilang mga populasyon, no? Because the kind of economic program that we were put into was itong globalization. Yung globalization po, ang gagawin nila, they take advantage of their low salary, itong mga mahihirap na bansa na mababa lang ang sweldo, dito nila dinadala yung kanilang trabaho. Pero kanya nila ginagawa ganyan para mas malaki ang kita nila dito sa mga industrialized countries. In the meantime, hindi po umuunlad yung mga bansa natin kasi ang sweldo po natin ay suppressed. Kanya hindi po gumagana. Pero ang tawag nila dyan, globalization. Dahil po dito, itong mga underdeveloped countries, hindi po nakahanda. Ang hindi po nakahanda dito sa ating world population, ang sinasabi po ni Harley, ay yung mga Africans. Kasi po yung Africans, noon pa nila nasusuppress yan na mga Africans. At hindi po sila matulungan at hindi po sila magkaroon ng infrastructure. Ngayon lang, in the past year or so, nag-umpisa na sila mag-infrastructure development. Kanya lang, kulang na kulang pa po yun dahil kakaumpisa lang po no? Sa tulong ng China. So they're expecting na hindi pa tapos itong pandemic na ito, aabot po sa maraming tatamaan at magiging victims nitong pandemic na ito. Kasi bumababa na po sa Southern Hemisphere yung sakit. Tinamaan na yung Northern Hemisphere, itong Europe, yung mga... Ito, nakita na natin sa Italy, pati na rin yung Amerika. Pero bababa ngayon yan sa Southern Hemisphere. Yung Southern Hemisphere, tayo po yon. At itong mga South American countries na hindi din nakahanda, marami din po silang mamamatay. Dito po sa atin, kaya po madalas sinasabi sa ating mga kasamahan, huwag kayong masyadong nagtatatalon for success na tinitignan nyo itong mga statistika nito, konti lang ang namamatay kasi ganita. Dahil hindi pa po tayong tinatamaan. Ang pinakakulang na kulang po natin talaga ay yung kapasidad dito sa Department of Health. Yan pong Secretary of Health natin, tsaka yung departamento, wala po tayong kaalaman, very incompetent, and lalo na, wala tayong mga materials that we need. Nagdo-donate na nga ang China, tatanggihan pa ni Duque. Nagdo-donate na nga itong Russia ng mga gamot, tinatanggihan pa ni Duque. Para bagang mas gusto pa ni Duque maraming mamatay. No? Alam niyo po, hindi ako nagugulat sa ganyang klaseng pag-iisip kasi ang mga depopulationists, yung mga taong sa palagay nila ang problema ng bansa ay overpopulation, nasisiyahan sila sa ganitong sitwasyon dahil alam nila mas marami pong mamamatay. Meron pong mga ganyan na taong mag-isip, huwag po kayo magugulat. They're all over the world. And the Philippines is not immune to them. We still have them here. No? At okay, meron po tayong mga comments na pumasok at hindi natin mailagay sa screen kaya hindi ko mabasa. Papabasa na lang natin dito sa ating technical head ng tsaka head ng Philippine LaRouche Society, si Itos. Go ahead, Itos.
Okay, good evening, Sir Butch, at sa lahat ng Katipunan. Napakahalaga ang programa nyo upang mamulat ng lahat ng katotohanan. Mabuhay po kayo. Fernando Escanio, Santa Mesa East, San Nicolas, Pangasinan.
Maraming salamat at kumusta kayo dyan sa Pangasinan? Sana mahusay at hindi po masyadong napoproblema.
Good PM mga Katipan at Sir Butch Valdez. Dati walang ginagawa ang mga barangay captain. Ngayon, naglilinis na sila at nagdi-disinfect sa buong barangay ng buong bansa para makontrol ang virus. Sana patuloy na nila itong gawin at huwag sundin ang kautusan ng DOH na tigilan na ang mga barangay sa pag-disinfect sa mga kalye at kalsada dahil wala daw pruweba na epektibo ito pag-control ng COVID virus. Mas mabuti na yung nag-iingat kaysa sa biglang kumalat ng virus. Sabi ng DOH, panatilihin ang kalinisan sa loob at labas ng bahay. Ngayon, tumupad ang mga barangay, pinatigil na nila ito. Sunny, KDP.
Tignan nyo yan, ha? Papatigil ng DOH ang paglilinis sa kapaligiran, no? Papatigil niya yung, kasi wala daw preba na nakakatulong ito. Alam nyo yung mga tiga-DOH na nagbibigay ng ganyang klaseng kautusan, dapat ikulong no? Dapat ikulong. Ano pang preba ang hinihintay nila? Maski na walang preba, basta papunta sa kalinisan, kalaban yan ng mga mikrobyo, kalaban yan ng mga virus, no? Ang kalinisan, kalaban talaga ng sakit. Hindi po ba? Sentido komon. Yung mga ganyan sa Department of Health, nagpipigil na wag maglinis ng kapaligiran, dapat ikulong. Dapat ikulong talaga sila.
Good PM Kabutch at mga Katipon, pwede po ba ninyong i-search si Dr. Fabunan? Taga Zambales po siya. Ayon sa kanya, siya po ay nakatuklas noong pa na mabisang pamatay sa pagsik na virus. Pero hindi po siya nabigyan ng pagkakataong ng mga kaukulan ng DOH. Sana masubukan ang kanyang gamot. Mante Matias.
Well, sana po nga. Kanya lang, wala tayo ngayong pamamaraan para magawa natin yan. Ang magagawa lang ni Mr. Fabunan ay paggamit na dito sa kanyang mga kasama sa barangay o yung mga kapitbahay niya na merong palagay niyang may coronavirus o yung mga nagpositibo, baka gusto nilang subukan. Kasi ngayon po, magsabihin mong na may positibo ka na mayroong kang coronavirus, wala din po naman linalabas na gamot itong itong DOH. Wala din po silang ibinibigay. Yung mga ventilators, yung parang nilalagay natin dito para makatulong sa paghinga, medyo paggrabe na po yun, paggrabe na ang may sakit at parang nalulunod na sila sa kanilang flema dahil punong-puno na po yung kanilang baga. No? So pag sinabi mong positive ka, wala silang binibigay na gamot. At bahala ka na sa buhay mo kung meron kang pambili ng mga vitamins. Itong Department of Health, yan lang ang kanilang may bibigay. Ngayon, itong kay Dr. Fabunan, ang pinakapayo ko dyan, gamitin niya sa kanyang mga kapiligiran, mga kapitbahay niya, at mga iba-iba pang mga na kung meron siyang kakilala na tiga doon sa kanila na merong COVID virus, no? At na positive siya, di tanong niya kung gustong gamitin. Alam niyo po, may mga gamot dito ngayon na ginagamit ng mga ibang hospital na tinatanggihan pa ng Department of Health kasi wala daw pruweba na mahusay yung gamot na yon. Pero lahat ng doktor doon sa mga hospital, yun ang binibigay nila. Etong chlorofluoroquine, no? Hydroxychloroquine, no? Yun ang sinasabi nila, binibigay nila. Gumaling sila. Maski na si Senator Angara, ang sinabi niya, nag-hydrofluoroquine din siya, no? At gumaling siya, no? Tapos itong Duque, ano bang hinihintay ni Duque? Komisyon galing sa mga ibang mga pharma companies Yung ba inihintay na o meron mag-offer sa kanyang ito pag pumasok ito dyan sa Department of Health, meron ka dito. Ganyan ba ang kanyang hinihintay, no? Kasi may reputasyon yan si Duque. Kung meron pa nga nagpapatanggal sa kanya dahil may kaso siya, di ba? Bago dumating itong kaso sa itong coronavirus thing. So,
Okay, continue. Yelena Kimpoyulo watching. Maribeth Sunier Anyakan, good evening.
good evening.
Vic Valparaiso, good evening po Sir Butch at mga ating katipunan. Glenn Buwan, our government will not listen, much less act in this way as suggested because people running our government are beholden and in bed with foreign, local, and international banksters. So how do we turn this around and make them work in our favor?
Yung problema, kanina, habang nagkikwento yung kasama natin dito si Harley Schlanger, pinapasukan ko para mapaliwanag ko na yung sinabi niya ay precisely nangyayari dito sa atin. Yung sinabi ng klaseng mga tao na nagpapatakbo ng gobyerno ay ang may hawak sa kanila itong mga oligarko, yan ang nangyayari sa atin ngayon, no? Yung sinabi na itong mga may hawak sa ekonomiya at saka sa mga banker sa central bank, sila ang uudyok o nagdidirect na kung ano ang gagawin ng bansa. Hindi na daw ang ating presidente. It is not our president that is running this country. It is these economic managers. And they're leading us to the dogs. They're creating the conditions so that mas maraming mamamatay sa atin. Yan po yan. Sino ba yan? Si Jokno, si Dominguez, si Pernia. Sila po ang leader niyan. At meron pa mga ibang mga liporers na kasama yan.
Okay. Freddy Oredina, we need the Glass-Steagall and Bretton Woods system to be implemented immediately to sustain the global growth equitably for humanity.
That's right, Freddy.
Shona Lee, good eve sa atin lahat. Baby Lita Estopa, watching from Japan. Hello po sa inyo.
How are you?
Leomar Beltran, seryoso po ba ang Pangulo o nagbibiro lang siya nung sinabi niyang magbebenta siya ng mga government assets as a last resort to fund this effort against COVID?
Alam niyo, sa palagay ko, hindi masyadong naiintindihan ng presidente kasi yung sitwasyon. At kanya siya nag-iisip na yan, na magbebenta siya ng mga ari-arian ng ating gobyerno. Ay ito na rin ang sinasabi sa kanya nila Jokno at saka nila Dominguez. No? These people, these advisors of the president are misleading him. And they're misleading him to become a failure. For sure. This is not going to be the same later on. But whatever he does not do now, that he has to do, and ayaw niyang gawin, dahil pinipigil siya nito mga ito, siya na rin ang magiging basihan ng pagbagsak ng kanyang administrasyon. Pagbagsak hindi lang ng administrasyon, pagpapahirap sa mga mamamayang Pilipino sa darating na panahon. Wala po dapat tayong ipagpatuloy dun sa mga nangyayaring sistema dati. Yung privatization, we have to stop that. No? These water and energy and public utilities must be given back to the government. But if this is not going to be done, no, the deterioration of this administration is going to be very fast. Much faster than the rise in popularity of the president. This is what's going to happen. The president is being misled. Naaawa po ako sa kanya dahil wala na siyang maski saan siya tumingin, wala pong tutulong sa kanya kasi ini-imagine ko po siya sa kanyang kabinete Lahat ng cabinet members niya tameme. Ang nagbibida-bida si Ben Jokno, si Dominguez at si Pernia. Titignan mo sila, paghihingan mo sila ng mga opinyon, yung mga kabinete niyan, tungkol sa ekonomiya, tameme yan. Wala akong makikita sa kanilang magsasalita tungkol dyan. Kaya nakakatakot eh. Kasi itong mga ito, bata ng IMF, bata ng mga oligarko, kalaban po nila ang ating pamahalaan. Ang pinakagusto nila ay population control or depopulation. Tandaan niyo po yan. Nasabi na namin yan paulit-ulit. Hindi po pagsalba ng buhay ang gusto niyan sila Jokno. Pangmalawakang pagpatay. Kasi sa kanilang paningin, ang solusyon na sa ating economic problems ay bawasan ang populasyon ng malawakan. No. Massive population control. Ibig sabihin, ang ibig sabihin ba niyan? Bawasan mo lang yung mga manganganak, birth control pills? Hindi po. Ang ibig sabihin niyan, pabayan mong mamatay ang tao pag nagkasakit. Huwag mong tulungan para dumami ang magkakasakit. Total, ang magkakasakit diyan at walang kayang mabuhay ay yung mga mahihirap. Yan ang mentality ng mga taong yan. Tandaan niyo po yan.
Okay, Luigi Fernando, maligayang Pasko at muling pagkabuhay ni Cristo. Virgio Nabi, we should change the economic and financial paradigm. Freddy Oredina, China and Russia started transactions in rubles and yuan in 2018. Jose Laurio Malonzo, good evening po, Professor Butch. Reggie Maloloyon, Benito, good evening po, Sir Butch. Masagana 99, yung presidente naghihintay ng bakuna. Ang mastermind si Duque. Ang Sanofi business partner ni Duque, may stocks and bonds si Bill Gates at donate din niya sa Sanofi. Ganito ka-evil ang hinaharap natin ngayon. Walang iyang Bill Gates, magsama sila ni Duque at Fauci, mga evil. Christina Barber, tama po, commission. Reggie Maloyo on Abenido, PI talaga yan si Duque. Na yan, mukha pa lang mandurugas. Good evening po. Good evening rin kay Sir Itos. Hello, Reggie. Pwede Ordina, we have plenty of money held by oligarchs. One is Supreme Court ruling on water concessionaires. 93 billion. Or penalty is 300K.
Yes, 93 billion. Hawak na ng Supreme Court yun. Hindi pa natin makolekta. Nag-decision ng Supreme Court. Tapos yung kinuha nila sa mamayan, yung sinabi ni Presidente na halos 1 trilyon na kinolekt na nila in advance para gumawa ng sewerage system. Wala silang ginawang sewerage system. So saan yung perang yon? Binulsan na naman nila. Ba't hindi natin makolekta yon, Mr. President? Dahil pinipigil ka nila Jokno at Dominguez. Ganyan yun talaga. No? At yun ang talagang punot dulo niyan. Hindi namin kayo kalaban, Mr. President. Sa inyo nga kami nakasalalay. We're completely dependent on you. And if you abandon us, when it comes to this, you will abandon us, no? This country will fail. And so will you.
Okay. Dario Padilla, good PM po. Si Duque po ay sunod-sunuran sa WHO na ang plano yata ay bawasan ang population sa mundo. Kaya ayaw niyang tumangkilik sa mga gamot na di galing sa ibang bansa o di kaya malaki ang commission niya sa mga hinihintay na gamot. Kung man manggagaling dapat dyan kay Duque ay matanggal sa pwesto. Rogelio Tamayo, hello, good evening po.
Well, yan, talaga naman si Duque, hindi mo maalis sa kanya yung ganyan klaseng connection, no? Pero ang lakas-lakas ng loob niya, siguro dahil kasama siya nito nila Jokno sa depopulation, so susuportahan siya nila Jokno pagdating kay Presidente Duterte, no? So sila nang may hawak. Parang sila na nagpapatakbo ngayon. Kanya ang presidente, sabihin, diyan ka na lang muna, kami nang bahala dito, Mr. President. Anong mangyayari naman sa taong bayan? No?
Okay, continuation ni Leomar Beltran. Kanina, yung question niya about selling government assets. Hindi po ba kataksilan yon? Sa halip na i-take over niya yung mga privately owned public utilities, magbebenta pa siya. Para na rin siyang si Ramos pag nagkataon. Benta dito, benta doon. Bakit hindi na lang niya habulin yung mga iba pang oligarko at kartel na meron pa rin natitirang bilyon-bilyong utang sa gobyerno hanggang ngayon?
Kanya nga, yan din ang tinatanong natin, Leonie, Beltran.
Yeah.
Yan din ang tinatanong natin, Mr. Beltran, na bakit ba parang hindi siya sumusunod sa sentido común? No? Bakit? What is going on? What is going on? Has he turned over the leadership of this country to this cabal of headed by Jokno, Duque, Dominguez, Pernia, and what's his name? Yun sa energy?
Si
Kusi. Na? Yung mga lipores ng mga oligarko, nandyan. These are the ass lickers of the oligarchs.
Okay, from Rene Maghinay. Hello, watching live here in Shanghai. Good evening po sa inyo lahat dyan. Maraming salamat po sa live. To say the truth, keep safe po and stay healthy.
Shanghai is a beautiful city. And sana when all of these things are free, and many of our people will go over and take a look at Shanghai. No? It's a beautiful cosmopolitan city, modern city. Okay,
last question. Freddy Oredina. Suggest a topic on universal health care. This can become Obamacare. Patients will be tied to medical experts and big pharma requiring prescription drugs. I suggest research and development using universal health care funds for, say, dengue, like in India, using papaya leaves here. Tawa-tawa. We need health expert, not medical expert, like Jaime Galvestan on Lagundi. Remember, big pharma objectives is put humanity into prescription drugs from womb to tomb. Oligarchs must not run the lives of we the people. We must be the owner-operator of public utilities represented by our government. Budget must not come from these greedy oligarchs, but must use the BRI initiated by China and BRICS through AID for world peace and warmonger British Empire using MI6 and CIA to control humanity.
That's right. Well, again po ang ano yung sinabi niya, siyempre sang-ayon tayo dyan, no? At hindi po tayo maglulubay, hindi natin lulubayan ang ating paninindigan, ang ating movement, no? Etong Kamao, etong Katipunan movement against oligarchs, hindi natin bibitawan ang ating mga kasamahan tungkol dito sa laban na ito. At tayo consistent. Kung minura natin ang oligarko noon, hanggang ngayon minumura po natin yan. No? Kung sinabi natin dapat makulong sila, hanggang ngayon sinasabi natin yan. Ang problema lang po, wala tayo sa gobyerno. Hindi natin mapatupad yung kinakailangan gawin. Pero siguro kung magsama-sama po tayo, mapapakinggan tayo ng mga nasa gobyerno. At kung hindi tayo papakinggan ng mga nasa gobyerno, ay darating ang panahon, gagawin na ng taong bayan kung anong kakailanganan gawin. Ako po si Butch Valdez. Maraming salamat po sa ngalan po ng ating mga katipon dito sa ating katipunan at sa magagaling na staff ng DCXL. Nakahook up tayo sa DCXL Radio mo nationwide. Dito po sa ating Katipunan channel. Kami po ay pansamantalang nagpapaalam at nagpapasalamat na sinamahan nyo kami ngayon. Ang oro de peligro ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo dito po sa ating Katipunan. Hanggang sa linggo pong muli, mga katipon, 7 to 9 p.m. Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat at Happy Easter!